my working life, I was in the collective bargaining department of the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. And as such, it has been my honor for just under 3 decades now to be referred to by one Brian D. Palmer, as often as he gets the chance, as a labor hack. But I also have to say, in Brian's defense, that it was he who gave me the chance to spend time with both Dorothy and Edward Thompson, and for that I will always be grateful to Brian. I have very good memories of both of them, except for the unfortunate incident with my malicious cat. It's a good thing that he liked cats. So that said, we're going to be talking about labor questions in our time. And I'm very saddened that Sam Gindin can't be here because, speaking on behalf of labor hacks everywhere, it was always a comfort to know that sitting out there was, in labor's, if not darkest hours, perhaps some of its most ridiculous ones, the figure of Sam Gindin, writing and speaking so clearly and so credibly and so very much spot on. So our first speaker today is Stephanie Ross, who is Associate Professor of Work and Labor Studies at York University, and she is also the President of the Canadian Association for Work and Labor Studies. She has a particular focus on contemporary trade unions, and her latest book is the 3rd edition of Building a Better World, Introduction to the Labor Movement in Canada.
Thanks very much. So let me start by saying thanks very much to Brian and Joan. I've only known them for about 10 years and I never studied with them, but I must say that both of them have always been very kind and warm and supportive of me and the efforts that I've been engaged in and the various institutions I've found myself in. And I'm deeply grateful for that. And it's, you know, I think that being in the academic universe, you will often find that sometimes academics are not very good people. Sometimes they think, you know, very individualistically, and that is not my experience of Brian and Joan and of many, many people in the room, and of course people in the broad field of labor studies that I'm going to talk to you about today. And I'm very grateful to be part of that community. I'm going to speak here as a non-historian. I'm not a historian. I'm actually a political scientist. But I'm one that I think has been deeply influenced by the tradition of Canadian labor history. New, but also probably the old Canadian labor history, because I somehow find the institutions of the labor movement very interesting. I guess for those of you who don't know me, I would kind of characterize myself as an academic misfit, really. I've always worked on the margins of various disciplines, the margins of political science, of sociology, of history. I never really fit anywhere within those disciplines, which probably explains why I found myself now as the evangelist-in-chief of the interdisciplinary field of labor studies in Canada, of which, of course, labor history is an essential part. And so what I'm going to offer today about the prospects of labor studies, particularly in the neoliberal university, comes out of that vantage point. So let me say something personal about labor studies and my encounter with it. My first encounter with labor studies in the university was actually, in large part, an encounter with Brian Palmer, although he probably doesn't know that. It was about 20 years ago, in fact, in the winter of 1995, and I was taking a class in working class politics with Leo Panish, who's also here today. A class that I took because I really didn't know what else to take, actually. The courses that I had gone to York political science to take were not really working out. I was really quite confused, and someone told me I should take a course with Panish, so in I went. On the first day of that course, Leo asked us students to locate ourselves in class terms in our introduction to each other. And in all honesty, and this is going to sound like hyperbole, but truly, it was like a bomb went off in my heart. Never in the 7 years that I had been in university up till that point had I ever been asked that question. Until that moment, I hadn't realized how thoroughly invisible working class experience was in most of university life, in the culture of the university, in its curriculum, how something so essential to my identity had been covered up with the unspoken codes and behaviors of bourgeois academia in which I was obviously becoming socialized. Until then, without being fully aware of it, I had been a stranger in paradise, as Brian and Zachary have called academics from working class origins. And the very next week, we were plunged into locating the working class in Canada, and to guide us in that task was, of course, Brian's working class experience. And I pored over that book as though it was a thriller. I made countless marginal notes. I nearly wore the book out. It is half falling apart now. I read, in particular, the passages about skilled craftsmen and their attachment to respectability. And, sorry, I understood my father for the first time. And that's a gift that Brian gave me that was delivered through Leo, and a personally and intellectually life-changing encounter for which I'm very grateful. So thank you for having me today to be able to tell you that in person and now on video for everyone to see. Okay. So this conference, celebrating Brian's work, is a welcome opportunity for me to place that very personal encounter with labor studies in the university into some larger context. What does it mean for us as a community of scholars to have created within universities spaces, courses, intellectual projects, networks of relationships, and even degree-granting programs designed to tell the story of working class experience, consciousness, organization, and struggle? What kind of achievement was that in the context of an educational system designed to reproduce class inequality and train a particular stratum of professional managerial workers, as much as it might have been also a way to provide routes to social mobility and human development, albeit for some? What are the prospects of preserving those achievements and strengthening the capacity of labor studies now that the university, or at least its leaders, has enthusiastically embraced neoliberal ideas about the role of higher education? Although the encounter between workers in universities stretches back to the 1930s, has been documented by many people in this room, like Joan Sangster, Radforth, Jeff Taylor, and their work on the Workers' Educational Association, labor studies as the interdisciplinary field we know today in universities began to emerge in the 1960s in a period of great dynamism in both the Canadian Academy and the Canadian labor movement. The rise of the New Left, the old and the new, the emergence of rank-and-file rebellions in the unions, a strike wave that extended across the industrialized West, the influx of working-class people into universities for the first time as a part of the post-war boom, all of these converged to promote both a scholarly and political interest in labor as a social force. This was largely expressed not just in the turn to social history, as we've discussed already in this conference, but also in my discipline in particular, in the development of the new Canadian political economy. This was certainly visible in the Canadian context as significant communities of scholars within the established disciplines of history, sociology, and political science all challenged both the appropriate subjects and methods of study in those disciplines. And we can also and should note that parallel pressures were also coming very strongly from the feminist movement at the same time. At the same time, the organized labor movement itself was confronting its own internal growing pains as membership continued to expand through the 60s and 70s, and they increasingly had to confront questions of capacity. For many unions, their own internal education programs were not well developed, whether in technical or political terms, and this generated contradictory pressures for various kinds of labor education. On the one hand, there were demands for professional training of the labor bureaucracy, particularly in terms of how to help union leaders and activists meet the demands of the growing complexity and legalization of post-war labor relations. Alliances between progressive university researchers and local labor unions led to the development of the first college and university-based certificate programs, most of which were tools courses aimed at providing an educational grounding for those people who were active in the labor movement and who were going to become their leaders. Indeed, in the United States, much of what is called labor studies remains focused on this role, with the university-based programs as an extension of the union's own educational program, even though, of course, the term extension in that context is really supposed to capture the way the university extends into the community. But I think it's actually quite appropriate to say that those university-based programs are really extensions of the union's educational programs, or perhaps substitutes for them. On the other hand, in Canada, this encounter between union members and progressive academics also led to desires for a broader, more ambitious and critical educational program and pressures for BA degrees in labor studies. Although perhaps to some extent it was the case that some wanted credentials, this primarily wasn't about credentialism or professionalization. Instead, many union activists wanted into the university to understand the working class reality in capitalist society more deeply, and to develop the critical capacities to counter the power of capital over their lives. However, existing programs, especially business, economics, and industrial relations, but also mainstream approaches to social science disciplines, were not comfortable for working class students, whether because courses' underlying assumptions took business or managerial priorities as a given, pathologized the working class, or simply made them invisible in a hegemonic middle-class culture. Those gaining access to university for the first time were still foreigners. And this is actually still true. Only a few years ago, I had a student come to my office who was taking my intro to labor relations class, who was a former postal worker who was re-entering in a labor market re-entry program through workers' compensation. And they had funded her to come back to university to take human resources management. So she was taking that program, but she was also taking my course. And she came to my class, in my office, and said that being in HR classes was making her sick, because the worldview that was being expressed was that of the managers that had victimized and bullied her, and that led to her leaving Canada Post. And so I think that that experience of being radically out of step with what is being taught in university is still a very present reality for many students. So labor studies created a space for working class people in the university, speaking with working class students about their reality in a way that a few other courses or programs could. Although these programs have also always cultivated relationships with unions, in Canada, they have maintained an autonomy from unions such that both the curriculum and research was never driven only by labor's immediate or narrowly defined practical needs. Although there were some years of struggle between social scientists and industrial relations and business profs, some of whom were threatened by the competition from and critical edge of labor studies programs, these were nonetheless established and often aided by progressive allies in university administrations, of which there were some, I guess, in the 1970s and 80s. That's unfair, but anyway. Of course, labor-focused teaching and research continue to be available outside of labor studies programs as such, but I would argue that where they have existed, standalone labor studies programs provided a center of gravity for that orientation, less easily swept aside by the rise and fall of intellectual fashions in the traditional disciplines. And I would say in response to some of the discussion we had earlier today, despite the very legitimate notion that class and labor should be mainstreamed in the traditional disciplines, I think that the comments that people have made about the constant marginalization of work and labor that they've experienced in those disciplines bears out the idea that it's very difficult for labor scholars who are isolated, maybe one or two in a particular department, to conduct this Sisyphean uphill battle to get labor centered in their disciplines. So programs, labor studies programs that were able to develop their own directly appointed faculty physically together with their students and each other created, I would argue, the most rich, enduring, and visible intellectual communities in the 1980s and 1990s. and drew in many non-traditional students whose experience of work or the labor movement brought them to labor studies. In other words, in my view, labor studies programs have constituted a counter-hegemonic or oppositional project that carved out space for working class people within an institution that generally took their subordination for granted. Now, coming to today, to 2015, English Canadian universities, and I'll speak only about English Canada, can count 6 standalone degree-granting labor studies programs. Unfortunately, the University of Windsor's program is no longer with us, but Simon Fraser University is about to establish one. In both Ontario and BC, enrollments in labor studies undergraduate courses are at all-time highs. In the labor studies programs that I know best, York, Brock, and McMaster, I think those three programs show the idea that labor courses don't fill is empirically false. Their respective first-year labor studies courses have between 300 to 400 students each every year. So we're talking about 1,500 first-year undergraduates in labor studies courses across the country. At York, our enrollment in the first-year labor studies class has doubled in 5 years. The number of majors in these programs, while not large in number, are stable and growing. In some places, very impressively. At Brock University, the labor studies program there, under the very dynamic leadership of Larry Savage, is the fastest growing program at Brock. So, this is actually a very impressive achievement in a context when traditional disciplines are experiencing, in the arts and social sciences, are experiencing troubling declines in their uptake, whether in terms of course enrollments or in majors. In other words, according to many of the measures now used to assess whether programs are successful, labor studies programs on the whole are small but very healthy. McMaster, which has the only master's program in labor studies in the country, will also accept its first class of PhD students in fall 2016. Another index of health is the formation of the Canadian Association for Work and Labor Studies in 2013, of which I'm the president, which now has over 150 members and has drawn over 100 people to each of its annual conferences in 2014 and 2015. This itself was built on the shoulders of an initiative that actually began here at Trent in 2006. In fact, in this very building, I believe, the New Voices in Labor Studies initiative, which was led by Steve Tufts, who was a professor at Trent at the time, but now at York, and Mark Thomas, who is also a colleague of mine at York, and was very strongly supported by both Brian and Joan. And this initiative brought together new scholars in the field of labor studies across disciplines, and increasingly over its 5-year run, linked university and union-based researchers. And next weekend at York's Global Labor Research Center, a symposium featuring the research of nearly 40 graduate students on work and labor issues is taking place. All of this indicates that there is both a critical mass of young researchers engaged in labor studies research and education, even if sometimes they don't label themselves as such. And there is a real thirst to build and belong to an intellectual community of progressive and engaged researchers dedicated to the study of work, workers, and their collective action. Why should this be? What explains the appeal of labor studies for students today, especially in an educational and labor market climate that is quite hostile to critical and counter-hegemonic projects? In some ways, I think we're very accustomed to a gloomy narrative about the status of labor studies in universities. As Jeff Taylor wrote in 2004, labor studies programs have a precarious place in Canadian universities and colleges. One can say the same for the study of work and workers in the traditional disciplines. As already mentioned, the piece that Julia Smith was a co-author of in Active History points to the very marginal space that work-themed research has in the Canadian History Association, and we can say exactly the same about sociology and political science. In 2009, in the Canadian Political Science Association, we organized a union and politics panel was the only one on work and labor issues that year in that whole program. And it was basically 10 of us who knew each other and were meeting with each other every year in the same room, same discussions, and not really meeting anyone beyond ourselves. So, you know, this marginality is real. Indeed, it was that very situation of always talking to ourselves in these small, isolated groups that led to the formation of calls. The health of the field that I have described is also experienced unevenly. Some labor studies programs are very under-resourced and must constantly fight for survival. Many have been labors of love for particular individuals, some of whom have sacrificed individual success, personal health, fighting to keep labor studies alive, and sometimes love has not been enough to keep those programs thriving, as in the case of the University of Windsor. Both Alan Sears and Alan Hall gave many years of their lives keeping that program alive, but unfortunately it no longer exists. Part of this story is about the fraught relationship between labor studies and the union movement. As both Michael and Andre mentioned earlier today, the stagnation and decline of unions has created challenges for labor studies programs. But I would argue that's only true, or it's primarily true, for certain programs and certain kinds of labor education. This isn't just about how declines in union membership diminish the potential student pool for university programs, although this is real. In the 15 years that I've been teaching undergraduate labor studies at 4 different institutions, the proportion of students who are union members, let alone union activists, has declined noticeably. But more than that, it's that the unions in Canada have never really embraced the idea that their members should seek a critical labor studies education, that they should play a role, that the union should play a role in actively facilitating that. While some union-university collaborations have been very successful, like McMaster's popular and relatively politically sophisticated joint labor studies certificate with Univ, and before that, of course, the CW, there have also always been tensions about the kind of education that labor studies programs should deliver and how critical it should be of existing labor movement structures and strategies. And I would say that particularly now that unions are on the defensive, union leaderships are less likely to actively encourage their members to engage in university-based labor education because it often raises questions about and expectations of their own organizations. This aloofness has had serious effects in particular places like, I would say, the University of Windsor, insofar as that program was dependent on a prior stream of union activists for viability and, among other things, wasn't able to reorient itself to a different kind of student before it was too late. There are other pressures that make viability of labor studies a constant struggle. As undergraduate education has become more expensive, working class students have found it harder to access post-secondary education in general, let alone critical labor studies education. The pressure on students to focus on career-relevant programs that lead directly to jobs has mounted, and this, coupled with labor studies' near invisibility in high school, pushes many students interested in studying work into human resource management programs, for instance. The neoliberalization of university education, both in terms of its purpose and its internal organization, has intensified these pressures. The need to document market demand, track students' labor market outcomes, and the use of metrics like measures to allocate resources all create challenging conditions for labor studies programs. Although, interestingly, many of them are already well placed to compete, quote unquote, in this neoliberal environment because of the practice of requiring placement courses and forms of experiential or service learning long before they became fashionable amongst university administrators. Neoliberal university administrations are less sympathetic to programs that foster critical consciousness about work, labor, and employment relations, however, and clearly are less likely to designate labor studies as a strategic priority for investment even when we perform well on their metrics. A crude but not invalid explanation is because universities' own labor relations are becoming increasingly fraught, and support for workers struggling within those institutions often comes from labor studies. For instance, at McMaster, when the staff went on strike in 2001, the labor studies program was the only one that refused to cross their picket line. And the point that Wayne Roberts made earlier about the fact that it's easier to accept radical colleagues if they aren't activists, particularly within the context of the university's own internal power arrangements, resonates. Insofar as labor studies academics tend to be scholar activists, they tend to disturb the fondly held myths of intellectual neutrality, not to mention the norm of bourgeois politeness and collegiality. However, I would say a deeper reason for administrative hostility, or at least aloofness to labor studies, is because it gives the lie to neoliberal universities' basic claim that they are the essential route to individual social mobility in the contemporary economy. The value and the power of the product of the neoliberal university, namely credentialized human capital, is in fact not holding, and indeed can only be diminished in an endless competition to attract and graduate more and more basic income units, as students are often now referred to. Labor studies research and teaching directly challenges this link between credentials and labor market outcomes, documents both the widespread and growing precarity amongst wider swaths of the population, creeping well into the professionalized segments of the labor market as well, and documents the persistent subordination in the labor market, and shows fairly clearly that the financial sustainability of the neoliberal university is based on a false promise. However, in my view, this is what constitutes labor studies' very appeal, albeit to a different kind of student than had been typically expected to appear in labor studies classrooms in the early days. Students in the university programs are less likely than in the past to be unionists coming from a critical perspective on their union work, although this type of student still exists. But for most students, even if their parents are union members and even if they have worked, most of them are likely to never have been in a union. However, that doesn't mean that students aren't progressive or interested in making changes in the world of work. Indeed, many students are very disillusioned with the labor market. They come to labor studies seeking answers to the question of why the economy is so broken for people of their generation and what they might do about it. The political economic context of a labor market that fails to generate secure and good work, the failed promises of contemporary work that is more stressful and more insecure, the constraints of workers' capacities to exert economic and political power, have all made labor studies more relevant than ever to helping students, as Sean, Julia, and Carl all pointed out in their comments this morning. So despite the real challenges we face, I remain cautiously optimistic about our future as a field. I am convinced that labor studies has a central role to play in the fight for economic and social justice, but maintaining our relevance will require shifts in focus and energy. First, labor studies programs will have to broaden their focus beyond the labor relations issues faced by unions. This means a renewed emphasis on studying work, on analyzing labor relations in non-union sectors of the economy, and exploring forms of worker organizing and agency that may include, but certainly go beyond the union form. Second, labor studies programs need to take seriously the invisibility of their teaching and research at the high school level and develop partnerships with each other, with teachers and their unions to get the labor studies curriculum, especially about work and workplace rights, in front of students before they leave high school. This isn't just about enrollments, but rather it is part of a counter-hegemonic struggle. High school students are not a blank slate, and their educations are increasingly pervaded at the high school level with the values of business and entrepreneurship. And we can't expect people to naturally understand that labor studies is an alternative perspective. If we believe in the value of critical labor studies education, we can't afford to passively wait for students to come to us. Our relative invisibility also exists within many universities. Given that everyone will need to work, even if they don't major in labor studies, we should commit ourselves to equipping students with the analysis and skills to engage in their workplaces in critical and progressive ways. This means developing more creative ways to serve populations of students that may not naturally gravitate to labor studies. Third, Labor studies programs need to make a priority of collaborating with each other through mutual support, knowledge sharing about the administrative, teaching, and research challenges we face, and developing strategies to build the field as a whole. If we make particular programs stronger and more visible, we make the entire field stronger and more visible. Fourth, labor studies programs need to renew their partnership with the labor movement. Neither can afford to remain separate from each other, and developing relationships with those unions who see the value of critical labor studies education and research is essential. I would argue that labor studies and the labor movement do need each other if workers are to regain real economic and political power in this society. Finally, and this is a challenge to all of us, and I take this as a challenge to myself, if the encounter with labor studies and labor history is to continue to have the potential to connect with and transform the lives of our students, especially those who are, like I was, strangers in paradise, we need to seriously consider whether we are telling stories that resonate with today's working class students, who are far more diverse, more likely not to be Canadian born, and more precarious than the previous two generations have been. I can't assume that the particular labor studies and labor history I encountered and that transformed my life will have the same emotional impact on my students. But I'm confident that as long as people are forced into capitalist work, are harmed and degraded by it economically, politically, culturally, and psychologically, labor studies will continue to change lives. And thanks in part to Brian, I will spend the rest of my life in service of that mission. Thank you.